and welcome along to FitMatters, where we talk about all things rider positioning and fit related. Today I'm here, we're spreading across the US and across the globe. Nuno's in Glasgow, Chris is in Middle America, and I'm out here on the West Coast, just gonna catch up with everybody. I think it's afternoon for you, right, Nuno?
Hi, Greg. Thanks very much for inviting me. Yeah.
Hey, Chris, what's going on out your way?
Moderate weather, but going to be cold.
Well, it's raining here.
Excellent. Well, that doesn't sound like usual weather for you.
No, it's usually very dry, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
There's a reason it's green.
Yeah, people don't notice that. Oh, it's so green, and the cows and everything. Well, yeah.
Yeah. That comes, we get the same thing back in New Zealand. So we've talked a little bit offline, and we've talked about subjects, and as we said, we could go on for hours and days, probably talking about all sorts of things fit related. But knees seem to be the topic of discussion always when we're talking about rider positioning, and everybody has sort of their own views on it. I know, Chris, you've been talking with some researchers, and I know, Nuno, you've been doing a whole lot of your own stuff. Where do we go? Why knees? Why are knees so important?
Well, I think, if I can start just going back in time, I was one of those guys when I started fitting that thought I didn't pay much attention to knees when I started fitting. And then as the fit school started to develop, I became extremely focused on patellar tracking and on joint angle and knee over pedal spindle. And what was interesting is how deep you can go, how that, it's just an area of concentration. It's like, I'm not, if I don't know what I'm doing, or if I'm trying to come up with something that's valid, I can say, okay, well, your knee should track vertically, your patella should track vertically, which we know now is absolutely not true. Your knee should track perfectly. And at one point it was the tibial tuberosity should line up with the center of the spindle, and then it was the front of the knee, front of the spindle, blah, 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 blah. But then with X amount of knee angle, this prescribed knee angle of, 25 to 35 degrees, which is huge. And I think that what ended up happening is I ended up positioning saddles high or far back, or actually just I was creating a scenario where people were focusing on their knees too much. They were focusing on their knees so much because I was focusing on their knees so much, when really, as you said before, Greg, the knee is the slave. It's kind of slave to the hips and the foot, and as you know, Nuno, from our conversations, that you're like, well, it's a thing, but it's not everything. So that's kind of my early history. I think it's progressed from there into looking at the knee as a variable in the context of bike fitting, and not the driving variable. I think more about pelvic stability and creating force. I think about float as it impacts knee. I think about stance as it impacts the knee, but not necessarily the knee itself, rather than the muscles that are driving the leg in relation to the knee.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that knees, it's one of those things which it's easy to track. You can, it's one of the easier things, I think, in positioning a rider that you can measure, and there's variance. And I think we can fall into that situation of tracking the numbers because it's a number which is easy to measure, and we see variation, and but it's just one component. And I think that's a really interesting point. We dating back to the COPS theories and stuff like that, and using laser alignment, and those are all valid ways of assessing some of the biomechanics of the pedaling action. But I'm sort of, I'm not sold on the knee. It is a dumb joint, it's whatever the hip does or whatever the ankle does, the knee has to follow. It really doesn't have any choice, and its function is not when it's stuck between two highly mobile joints, and the knee is not a highly mobile joint. That's, I think, where most of the people see their issues manifest. And I think bike positioning, we tend to have chronic issues in bike positioning more than acute issues. And like dealing with any chronic pain issue, the site of the pain is seldom the source of the pain. So, looking at how we take or how we consider knees in the total equation, I think, is really vital.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with both of you. I agree. I think we've established from talks, me and Chris and other members of the biomechanics and bike fitting community, we've established that knee and saddle height as a result of the knee joint is not the drive for the fit. It's more or less an outcome. I think knee is a popular issue for two main reasons. One is the variability in how the knee works in cycling, and we have all sorts of different types of knee tracking differently and functioning perfectly well, and that creates kind of an imbalance in the human mind, and people start to say things like, if that person tracks outwards in a V shape, like in a varus kind of moment, and he has really good results, why does my knee track in a valgus moment? Or and we start comparing with each other, and there's one thing that we forget, which is the function. And if something is not broken, we usually say, don't try to fix it, because the function is there and it's functioning as is. Like you said, Greg, the knee is really easy to track. It's easy to track for several reasons. It's one joint. It has very protruding bony landmarks that are easy to track, but also the knee is a hot topic, because, for instance, if you take the knee absorbs every force, every compression that you get, for instance, running, or even when you apply force on the pedals. It is the knee, kind of the relay station between what happens at the ankle, what happens at the hip. And if you take the spine as an example, we've got all those intervertebral discs acting as a whole to absorb those compressions. The knee doesn't have anything like that. It's got meniscus, right, and that's it. And so the compression and the forces are usually too great for that, and so there's injuries associated with that. If I can share my screen, I would like to show you.
Sure.
Share this screen. Can you guys see my screen, right?
I can't right now. You should be able to click on your share screen button.
Yeah.
There, and that should come up. Let me just see if we go to this.
Share my entire screen. Yeah. So there you go.
No, I don't know.
You don't have it?
Interesting.
No.
Oh, well, anyway, I was going to show you a.
Try this.
No, don't have it. Yeah. Anyway, I was going to show you an image of Pozzovivo. If you guys know Domenico Pozzovivo, he's got a huge varus knee condition, and he's one of the best climbers in the world, right? And there, often today there is the mentality that if you see something that is not tracking correctly, then that needs to be addressed. But whereas I think most of us three think function first, and if it's functioning correctly, then there's no need to actually address anything, because there's nothing there to be addressed.
Yeah, it's funny. Just this time of year as well, gets me thinking about knees when I see all the riders going past the studio door, and it's cold outside, and everybody's still got shorts on.
Well, wait a minute. Tell me what cold is.
Well, okay, it's relatively. Come on, dude, it's cold.
Give me the number.
I mean, you've got to understand. We get down to 12 or 13 degrees Celsius here in the winter. It's chilly. No, it's. But yeah, it's relative relative cold, the body adapts. But
I know.
I think there's some interesting research about what happens to the synovial fluid at different temperatures, and I think that's a pretty constant, and we understand how that reacts. But the number of people out riding without knee coverings in colder weather, and then the phone starts ringing, or I start getting emails that my knee's starting to hurt. Can I come in and get you to look at my fit? And, obviously, typically there's nothing wrong with the position. There's just something wrong with the knee. So, there's not only is the knee doesn't have the capacity to absorb shock very well, it doesn't have the capacity to temperature shift. So I think that's another, that's another issue which is out there, which is something people, experience quite a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that's really interesting to me is the variability in bone morphology. Is this we're on the IP here? There's a video.
This is someone else. This is sorry to interrupt that. I just got it to work.
Yeah.
This is someone else. But look at his knee. Look at his left knee. Look at that.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. There's this guy that's a professional football player I work with who's extremely valgus, and he said to me, I said, wow, you've got some really valgus knees. And he said, yeah, but you know what? Nobody can push me down.
Exactly.
When I brace, nobody can push me down. And it's right to that. This is one of those, there's a perfect example. And actually, he's kind of moving from a varus to valgus.
He's got all over the place.
Yeah, it's all over the place, which.
It's interesting there. You almost see, and I'm just looking at the picture now. There's some tibial varum, almost from a bone structure standpoint.
Yeah.
And then he's got this whole funky thing going on with that left hip where he can't control the medial collapse.
Yeah,
and this is a professional rider doing the Giro, and he did the 3 weeks.
Right.
Yeah.
And he's just been caught up by the peloton here. So. This is someone who's functioning pretty well, I would say.
Well, that's the statement I make to people who come in. Like all my clients who come to see me are 100% functional. Everybody's riding their bike. It's not like people aren't being rolled in here on a gurney. Yeah. But they're 100% functional. But and that's the adaptive. Whether we call it high level compensation or whatever, that's just how adaptable we are. So I think it comes back to, either duty cycles on the knee, what can a knee sustain? And some knees can sustain more duty cycles than others.
Yeah. So one of the things, what I was going to say before, that's incredibly intriguing to me is rotational component of the tibia and femur in relation relative to the tibial-femoral arthrokinematics, and just that. When I looked, I wrote a 3D program back in 2010 and came to the conclusion that, well, we're not symmetrical, so that's not really it isn't a great tool for bike fitting. But the one thing that I learned in doing about 300 trials is that virtually everybody that I fit had 4 degrees of float, at least 4 degrees of float. And I did this by looking at the pedal, I triangulated the foot on the pedal and watched the sinusoidal wave to see whether or not they were within the float, and if they weren't, the wave would have a flat spot on the top or the bottom of the internal and external rotation. And the thing that's interesting, the reason that's intriguing to me is because I don't see it when people are pedaling. When somebody's pedaling, I don't see that rotation to the foot. It just looks like, their foot is staying in the same place. But also, what are the implications of locking that out? When I get Durace pedals and they come with the blue cleat, and I get 2 degrees of float, 1 degree of float. And I had to stock, when I was doing it, I was stocking a bunch of the yellow cleats because when I had top tier riders coming in with the reds or the blues, I'm like, hey, you know what? Here's the data, and I'd show them the data, and ultimately nobody complained about it. But I'm curious why what is it that's attractive to a rider about having no float? Why is it attractive to people? I get these track racers, these professional track racers are like, no, zero float, lock me in. You guys got an answer?
I think a lot of people perceive float as an inefficiency. They see it as you losing or wasting energy. And I don't know whether that's, I'm not aware of any research which has sort of looked at that, but I think, getting people out of that thought process that we don't move, or educating people that we don't move in straight lines, that every time we move, everything is a slight shift, off the center lines. We're always making these micro adjustments, like put somebody on a balance board and just what they do, it's perturbation happening all the time. We sort of see it. I put people on the force plate here, and you just let them watch their center of mass as they're trying to stand still, and their center of mass is like bouncing all over the screen. I've magnified the sensitivity, and that sort of helps to educate people about just how much we move in space when we actually think we're completely stable.
Yeah, I think what happens with the mentality that you have to be locked in is actually when you exert float, you are wasting. So the force vector that should be going straight down to the transmission, it gets a little bit reduced or divided by the float, the torque. But the thing is, that doesn't necessarily happen. So the way that the talonavicular bone joins with the calcaneus, when we go into dorsiflexion or plantar flexion of the foot, our tibia goes into external or internal rotation. Okay, so when we dorsiflex, the tibia goes into external rotation. When we plantarflex, the tibia goes into internal rotation. This happens every time you go in a cycle, because when you're going down the pedal stroke, you're going to exert more of a plantar flexion, and then you're going to go into dorsiflexion, plantar flexion, dorsiflexion, even for a little bit. As you do that, the tibia does that as well. So if you don't have float, if you don't have the foot to accommodate those tibial torsions, where is that going to end up? Up at the knee. The knee is really good at bending, but it's not so good at doing this. And it's not so good at doing this, right? And so we actually do need float. We do need float to accommodate for those tibial torsions. Yeah.
Well, that's the exact, and this is what I do, here in the clinic, and you guys can see this, and we're familiar with it from the hip standpoint. Is just showing people that when one thing moves, everything else rotates.
Oh yeah. Oh, that's really.
And just from a tensegrity standpoint, you've just, when you show someone this, I'm like, if I move this bit here, everything on the opposite side moves as well. And so getting people to understand that is like, oh, really? That's how we move? I'm like, yeah, we don't just, it's not hinges and rotational pivots. It's like.
Can you give me a link for that?
Yes, certainly.
I want one of those.
I do. I'd play all day with this if I'm like.
I would play with it all day too.
I've got a much bigger one as well, but it's like. Yeah, and so just understanding that for a lot of people, how we move in space, and that's the human, we are. It just gave me a thought. It's kind of like if we talk about float and lack of efficiency, and like Nuno's saying, people are thinking that we're not efficient in those force vectors. When you think about it in relationship to food, and how much when we eat food, just how much of it actually gets used. And we're just not that efficient as a mechanism doing anything.
Wonderful.
It's a wonderful thought.
That's a really good point.
Right.
It's like, okay, 25% I'm 25% efficient with food,
Yeah, that's awesome.
Let me write that down.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can you guys see my screen actually?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So this is just a paper that I found. I thought it was interesting that all the knee pain and all the knee problems, and then you get what was the problem? Saddle too high, saddle too high, saddle too high.
So hang on, just let me get this straight. Are you suggesting that most people have their saddle too high?
Oh my God!
Yeah. The thing is, You know why this is? Because, and I think this is just my opinion, but I think it's because of the prevalence of injury due to patellofemoral forces like chondromalacia, those types of injury, anterior tendon injury, ruptures, chondromalacia, and all of that. And so we've gone to the other side, which is the saddle cannot be too low. It cannot be too low. Otherwise, the forces, the anterior forces, the posterior anterior axis is just going to be too great. So the saddle has to be too high. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have all those movements on and then the saddle is the wrong saddle because nobody can sit too high in the saddle without, some kind of lateral movement because they're attached to the pedals. And then they need to do some, saddle pressure mapping to see why is this saddle so high, so wrong for me, etc., etc., etc. But yeah, there's a lot of injuries associated with the saddle too high. Most of them ACL, most of them soft tissue injuries, not necessarily related to the knee. The bicep femoris or the semitendinosus insertion, those thick tendons at the back of your knee. Those get strained a lot with the saddle too high. You get tendinitis, you get ACL tendinitis, you get lots of different problems, not necessarily related to the knee, because I would consider knee problems the patella, ACL, the ligaments in the knee, the meniscus. That is knee problem for me, I would say.
Well, and interestingly, with cycling, I've got plenty of clients who have no ACL, bilateral ACL destruction. Doesn't affect them riding the bike hugely at all.
Doesn't have to.
Guys who so yeah, the knee is positioned correctly. The knee has huge latitude in its dysfunction to still perform, if that makes sense. I don't know whether I explained that correctly.
Yeah. Well, I think the research, you look at the research also, and I think that, one of the things that they're not looking at is cleat position, which I think has much more impact on knee, anterior knee pain. I see, when you look at the low saddle height, it's anterior knee pain, patellofemoral compression, blah, 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 blah. Well, though there was patellofemoral compression in the high saddle position too. But I look at cleat position, where's the cleat on the foot? What part of the foot are they pushing through? If my cleat's all the way forward and I'm pushing through the ball of my foot, intentionally pushing into the pedal body, well, the recruitment patterns that I've seen working with EMG is that the recruitment patterns are more distal towards the knee, distal quadriceps, versus a lot of the posterior chain where that muscle tension relationship is pretty much non-existent.
Yeah, it's interesting. So that brings up a really interesting thought process. Now, we've talked about, and everybody's talked about the knee over pedal spindle, as that was where everybody was for a long time, and it was not without its issues. And then we've sort of moved away from that. But interestingly, and it just sort of came to me as a thought process, the knee over the pedal spindle would work if the cleat was in the correct position on the foot. Because if we equate it to something like deadlifting, if I'm working with a high, capacity deadlifter, someone who's pulling a lot of weight, if we keep that knee over the right place in the foot and we're trying to keep the tibia as vertical as possible, we can put huge amounts of load through it. So if you were to position the knee over the pedal spindle, given that the pedal spindle was, okay, no, that's not going to work. I just thought that through. It's exactly the opposite. What a dumbass.
No, I don't think it's a dumbass. I think that's what it does is it makes me think. The first thought that came to mind when you were telling me that is, well, that makes some sense. And then I think about the variability in posterior tension, where some people have to ride. Some guys, I get guys come in. Some of the fastest riders I know have saddles that look, it's almost instinctual. They look too low to me, and they almost instinctual. They look too far forward to me. So yeah, I don't think that's it.
Yeah, but that's always been, if you can keep the knee has a huge amount of capacity to it as long as we don't go out near its end of functional range.
Yeah.
And we don't. That's sort of one of the other discussions is that the human condition is so used to having having terminal knee extension and hip extension, that being positioned on a bicycle feels very foreign to a lot of people, especially runners.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, so much. That's a big challenge I have with triathletes, is getting to adopt a good saddle position. And so to try to convince myself out of that. So what I do with triathletes is I try to get them to become more of a pedal masher, because they do want to dance on the pedals, or I should say, I like dance like a ballerina, they're pointing. And they want that saddle super duper high to the point where they're basically in that screwing home. It's literally the bike is pedaling them instead of them pedaling the bike. Right. But so I'm always playing mind games with myself, trying to understand why something is, and I know it's because they run a blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, well, maybe for a short period of time, I was like, well, maybe having a triathlete's position higher will help them run off the bike, because their hamstrings are in a constant state of lengthening, but that doesn't, I tried it didn't work. I went with it for a little bit, and I'm like, okay, no, that's not it. The forward saddle position for the psoas, I get that's logical to me, and it seems to make sense. But those are the hardest times to get that.
That's almost like accommodating around their poor function, because we know, it's like, oh, you've got super tight, iliopsoas complex, and we're just going to position around it. So that's like dealing with the symptom rather than dealing with the cause, right? And the problem is that not a lot of people want to deal with the cause. Part of the reason we have so many of these issues is we have this sedentary lifestyle. So many people spend so much time seated, and then going from that flexed hip position of being seated to going to a flexed hip position on a bicycle and trying to produce large amounts of force. That's where the problem comes in.
Yeah. So it's just been a challenge. I think that if there's a challenge in my practice, it's teaching multi-sport athletes to appreciate saddle height, which allows them to use force throughout the pedal scope. Did I say that okay? Yeah. You know what I'm trying to say? I'm trying to say is that, like, when I look at, if you take a video, and I don't use markers and stuff, but I do show people video, when you watch somebody pedal, a lot of times there's this delay where the leg stops extending and the hip starts to come down.
Yeah, well, that's a neurological defense. That's a neurological defense because we prioritize the hamstrings have a much higher neurological priority than the quadriceps do. So we will basically, we get into this range because our quadriceps, you and I have had this discussion before, Chris, about, our quadriceps are used at their greatest expression for terminal knee extension. That's where they really, excel, right? They're really good at terminal knee extension. But our hamstrings don't like to completely extend. And I think neurologically we guard the hamstrings at some level. And that's why you see with a lot of people, when they get to that point where their hamstrings, it's not that they can't extend any further, because it's that situation where you'll see somebody who has this, weird pedaling mechanic at the end of their pedal stroke, at the end of leg extension for them. But then you put them on the table and passively they have the extension available. So they actually have the range. It's just functionally they don't have it. Because neurologically, as they protect that hamstring, when they get to the point where it doesn't want to extend anymore, they've got two options: either drop the hip or plantar flex the foot.
Yeah.
And I think depending on both of those evolutionary things, we are neurologically evolved to prioritize postural position over phasic implication of a muscle. So we would much rather be upright than be moving. And for me, I tell a lot of the people who come to see me, that's illustrated by if you're moving over uneven ground and you lose your balance, the first thing you do is you just freeze and everything becomes, hypertonic. Everything locks up. And then when the brain senses it's out of danger, it releases everything, you're able to move again. So that's the freeze response.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, and I think we see that a lot with that, when you get too high in the saddle, if you can't express, and some people can express true lengthening of their hamstrings at their ranges, at their end of range.
Yeah, that's very good. Very good. It's true. It's that, and it's almost like we should be paying more attention. And I do look at the ankle and the hip instead of knee extension when I'm adjusting for saddle height.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that, once again, the knee is very easy to visualize and to measure. And so I think that sort of led us down that track of, well, if it's, we'll do it, because I think there's not a lot of people think as holistically as they need to. When we just, it's like certain, let's call them brands who, here's your range. If you're between X range and X range, you're good.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's kind of not how it's like averages, right? Averages just don't work. Otherwise, if it was all about averages, we'd all be running around with one ovary and one testicle. That's the average of the population.
1.5 testicles, I think.
Right.
Yeah.
So and that's we
got to be precise here.
Right, exactly. We're in the science. We deal in science. But Chris and I, Nuno, had this discussion. It was just an observation I've made over the years about how the quadriceps are implicated with the knee, and in cyclists, how we see overdeveloped VMOs and overdeveloped lateralis, but very seldom in a cyclist will you see a massive hypertrophy in rectus femoris. Because the main job of the quadriceps and the cycling mechanic is not so much to produce force, but it's to control force. So we're constantly using lateralis and VMO to control that medial lateral track, but we're not really implicating rectus femoris at its maximal capacity, because we're not approaching terminal knee extension, which is where rectus femoris really excels.
Yeah, and that you just said is a very important point, because the range of motion of the vastus lateralis and vastus medialis is closer to the extension of the knee, to the total extension of the knee, and that limits the function of those muscles a little bit.
Right.
Not like the posterior leg of the wall, which has a much wider range of motion.
Right. So yeah, and I think you see it at extremes, like certainly in track sprinters. You see more hypertrophy of rectus femoris, because they do use, they get more extension because they're out of the saddle for a greater period of their event, as from the starting position, but obviously they try and get back in the saddle as quickly as they can. But that's the one cyclist or group of cyclists I've seen, I don't see many. I don't see any.
But the rectus femoris is biarticular, isn't it?
Yeah, I believe
it crosses two joints.
Yeah.
The fact that you have to close so when you're standing and you have to pull up that knee, that is the rectus femoris.
Yeah,
and the
or kick it, or to kick it. This guy Tom Coleman, who's really smart guy out here, fitter, he has his cyclists, the people that he sponsors, cycle through different pedaling styles, and one of the styles that they use to combat fatigue is the kicking. And you do have to have good patellar tracking and a large patellofemoral, patellar tendon, and how to do it properly. But the pennation of that muscle is conducive. Kicking a soccer ball, you can kick a soccer ball. And so what he would do is one of the patterns that he would have people do is kick over the top. And I actually did a biofeedback protocol with that. It was effective, but people overdid it. And of course it caused just excessive patellofemoral compression. But yeah, it is interesting that we don't, I look at the way the knee functions when walking, and during the gait cycle, we bring the leg forward. We don't think about where we're going to put that. We think about where we're going to put our front foot, but we don't think about what's happening with the back leg. And with cycling, a lot of people start pulling in the back, when in reality, if we were more walking, if we paid more attention to walking, I think it would be a more effective way to get over the top of the pedal stroke. It's not a forceful rectus kick. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it is. You know, I don't know where that whole pulling up thing has come from. Well, kind of, I do. But it's certainly, you know, everybody, you know, numerous new cyclists I have come in and go, I don't feel like I'm pulling up enough on my pedal stroke. I'm like, that's awesome.
Good job.
You're probably good job. Yeah, you're probably pedaling okay then. You know, if you feel like you're pulling up, we have some bigger issues to deal with.
Yeah. So what do you guys feel about?
I mean, what else have we got to cover?
I'd like to know your opinion on a very popular method of knee alignment, which is the wedges.
Oh, dude,
because
you are opening a Pandora's box here.
It's not. It really isn't. Can you see my screen actually?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, okay.
No, I can't see. I can't see. Oh, there it is. Yeah.
Oh, there it is. It's this notion that
please don't get us in copyright infringement here.
No, I'm sharing bike fitting website, bikefit.com website.
Yep.
Yes.
So this is public knowledge and public domain. So I'm just sharing their website, and it's this notion that if you put a wedge, and if you put a wedge on the foot, you are able to align the knee. And there's two things wrong with this. One,
if you put a banana on your head, you're also able to. Sorry.
One, it's the notion that the knee needs to be aligned, and as we've seen from that rider, Simone, and even there's lots of different riders, and I talked about Pozzo Vivo, and it's this notion that if someone sees a knee that's outwards in a varus moment, it needs to be aligned, and you know, there are bike fitters being trained this way. You have to use the wedge. And then there's the notion that if you put something on your foot, it will transmit that degree of inclination up the stream, and this makes no sense. Otherwise, every time you step on a pebble, you would fall or you'd walk, you know, inclined. So the foot is just a wonderful piece of equipment that absorbs any type of irregularities, and it's just built to keep our vestibular centers upright with the horizon. We're able to just stand on a mountain and our heads are completely leveled. I mean, a dog stands on the mountain and his head is lower than his butt, right? So I mean, we have a really good tool here, which is our feet. And just the notion of putting a wedge to align the knee, to me, is confusing. I don't know about you.
Well, so, yeah, I mean, to me, it's always been confusing because that's a global adjustment. So I'm, you know, interestingly, I mean, Nuno, you and I are both feet guys. You know, I mean, I love feet are just the most complex, you know, I always say, when you've got something which has got 26 bones and 33 articulate surfaces, there's some stuff going on. Yeah. It's some very clever design, and some stuff can go wrong. But the interesting thing is it can also be very, very adaptable, and we see that on a daily basis. Like I have people come in every day where I'm doing, you know, custom footbed work for, and it's just like, how do you get through your day? And it's just, you know, how adaptable we are. Going back, you know, we can take that back to the food analogy. When you see someone walking down the street smoking a cigarette and drinking a big gulp, and they're 300 pounds, you're just like, wow, that's just shows how adaptable the human body is. That you can do bad stuff to it and it still continues to function. Our feet sort of fall into that category as well. Yeah. But if you wedge that, especially if you wedge the shoe, you're tilting the entire relation. You're changing the relationship between the calcaneus, the talus, and the distal aspect of the tibia, the tibial plateau.
Yeah, I agree. I think that I do wedge, but mostly to correct shoe deformity. I don't think shoes are in the correct plane forefoot to heel a lot of the time, especially nylon shoes or shoes that have been used a lot or they get deformed. So I'll do that to correct what I perceive as a shoe deformity, where I see I look at the shoe interface to the pedal versus what's going on in the mechanics of the body. I use insoles. I don't use corrective insoles. I use an insole that actually stimulates the foot or increases or improves the distribution of force through the foot is balanced as possible. And I don't need to use much in the way of shims and wedges. It is interesting that people perceive an improvement with wedging. If I put a 4-foot post, if I drop something into a shoe, and I'm clearly observing compression. So if I can see that I'm now creating compression in the medial knee joint, it doesn't matter. They like it. I think that the reason wedging and shimming is popular is because for some reason it feels more powerful. Feels doesn't mean it is.
Well,
I don't understand.
That's because we have a huge amount of proprioception coming out of our feet. Our feet are incredible proprioceptive devices. And so, yeah, you make an adjustment there and people feel different, but that doesn't correlate with optimal. If that's, because I will 4-foot wedge people, but I very, very seldom will full foot wedge somebody because I would rather get joint centration through the calcaneus and the talus and the distal aspect of the tibia, and then look at what's happening to the 4-foot to look what we need to do to correct the 4-foot. And I feel the goal of increasing proprioception out of the foot is the ultimate goal for me.
Yeah, I think so too. What do you got there, Nuno?
Oh, this is just a quick example of someone that came in the other day, last year actually, who was presenting with localized pain in the fifth metatarsal, in the tuberosity of the fifth metatarsal. That's that bit, that blue bit over there on the left-hand side. Can you see my mouse actually?
No, I cannot see your
No,
mouse.
not really. That's okay. So the blue bit on the first image, on the top image, and often that's due to the shoe, compressing on that side. But as soon as I measured them, and they had underneath the insole one of those specialized wedges, right? And as soon as I took that off, I took the second image, and the second image shows just a better distribution of pressure, and immediately he felt relief. Okay, and then I did a little bit more, so I tried to smear that pressure, increase the area with an insole, and I happened to use an insole that I had, which did not facilitate the navicular arch, the placement of the navicular arch. So it was in the wrong place. The height was right. I would want that arch moved a little bit towards the heel a little bit more, but that insole didn't have that facility. But still, you can see that step 1, step 2, step 3 kind of is an increase in not only the pressure distribution, because that's what we want, because the force is the same. He was pedaling at the same cadence and wattage, yes. And this is what we want. So often it is the case that, and this person just put the wedge in because he thought he had a pronated foot or a supinated foot. I can't remember now. But this just shows that when you put a wedge, and I forgot to mention, nothing happened to the knee kinematics. The knee was the same in all 3 conditions. So when you put a wedge, most likely you're increasing or changing the center of mass on the foot, changing the pressure on the foot, nothing happening at the knee. And this is what you have to be aware of when you use wedges. Because if you use wedges to correct the knee, I think there are some studies out there that look at wedges and knees, but you have to use wedges as thick as this, like 15-degree wedges, for it to have an impact on the knee.
Well, but I think where the wedge really, I think, gets traction is it just comes back to this reductionist approach. It's like, when you see that picture and it's out of alignment and and the force vector is
Yeah.
changing directions, and then you align everything in a straight line. Well, that does look good on paper, but that is very seldom how we work and function. And it is our society has come to a point where we love the reductionist approach.
Oh yeah, like when I was doing the 3D program, one of the hardest things for me to do was so I did it in terms that would make sense to people. There were data points that were numerical, and then and then I did some visual and trying to make the knee look like it was tracking vertically. And the amount of modification that I had to do to the data, the smoothing and the stuff like that, to make it look the way that that it would look if somebody said that he's tracking properly, it was borderline unethical.
Yeah.
I think the number of people I see from a foot structure who actually have the biggest problem, and it'd be interesting to hear your take on this too, Nuno, is it's just it's medial arch collapse is probably 85% of the issue that I see every day. And people are like, oh no, I have a varused forefoot or something like that, and I'm like, okay, well, let me give you the correct amount of medial support, and we get joint centration through the rear foot, and it's like, oh look, no, you have a neutral forefoot.
I agree with that.
Well, and the other one I see a lot is, and this is hallux limitus or hallux rigidus.
Yeah.
In triathletes specifically, which has no bearing on the bike at all. But if you're a triathlete or in your everyday function, it has a big bearing.
Tell them what that means.
So it's when the big toe, the first ray, the joint mobility has started to reduce. And it can be both, I think, a genetic trait, and it can be an environmental trait as well. Sometimes, we see it on both feet bilaterally. Sometimes I just see it on one foot, and that can be a function of someone who's, say, been a kicker in football, or for any other reasons where they've had trauma to the forefoot, certainly trauma to that first metatarsal. But when the big toe doesn't flex properly, then the foot can't function the way it's meant to. And it's going back to what I said earlier, it's another great example of how adaptable the foot is, that you can take away large percentages of its function, say with medial arch collapse and first ray dysfunction, and you can still pretty much do everything.
Yeah, exactly. And just
and the repercussion
for the viewers, I just want to clarify for our viewers that you can actually test that on yourself by playing around with your big toe. Yeah.
Let me grab a foot, just a second.
Yeah, I think for the viewers, it would be helpful for them to understand that the terminology we're using.
What do you mean grab a foot, Greg?
Grab a foot. I'm practicing yoga, mate.
Wow.
So
that's your foot.
Here's my
That's
foot.
your foot.
That's it. I used to say this was my ex-mother-in-law's foot. So there's a whole joke behind that one. So let's say we've got the foot here, and these are the four, the 5 toes here. This is the big toe here, and the little toe out in here. This is what we call the first metatarsal and the fifth metatarsal. And what we're talking about with this dysfunction of the first metatarsal, hallux limitus or hallux rigidus, is this joint here right at the end starts to stiffen up. And so what happens is with your foot, when you go to step, your foot starts to step like this and your big toe essentially jams. And so you will either externally rotate or supinate, roll to the outside. So this is supination and this is pronation of the foot. This supination, pronation. You will either externally rotate or supinate early if this big toe joint doesn't function the way it should. And it's a really common, like, Nuno, how often do you see it?
Not very often in cycling, to be honest, but I don't know if it's because of Glasgow.
Yeah.
I see it with triathletes a lot.
Yeah,
triathletes and runners.
Yep.
The thing is, and this is what I don't know, because and this comes back to the way force or the way that propulsion and human gait happens, and most of the force goes through the big toe, the hallux. And when you amputate that finger, that hallux, the force is different, and the gait is different, and you're not able to generate the same propulsion. You're not able to propulse yourself forward as well. So it's massively important that particular joint is working.
Well, I
very
think
well.
not only is it a joint function, I think that goes back to the level of proprioceptive feedback coming out of your foot. And I think it's a very high level. I'll look back through my files and stuff like that, but I've got the research somewhere. It's a very high level of proprioception coming out of that big toe. So not only is it a function issue when you take it away or take away its function, but it's also a neurological issue where you almost get a neurological limiter.
Yeah.
Where it's like, I can't sense it's there, so I'm not going to put force. I'm going to limit the amount of force we're putting through that, that area.
So this is a can of worms.
I like that can of worms. That's a good one.
Because not only because of the level of proprioception and how you can change things in the bike fit just by addressing the feet and addressing things at the foot level. And you can even make things work kind of as a placebo, by showing them or by introducing something at the level of the foot, and then it works as a placebo to increase stability elsewhere. So that's the proprioception side of it. But then there's something that hasn't been studied yet, that it's a question in my mind, which links the first metatarsal joint with the windlass mechanism that happens during walking and gait, and that which doesn't happen in cycling, because I am not sure the windlass mechanism happens in cycling, just because the hallux you cannot elevate the hallux, and the force transmission in cycling is different.
Yes, I think the complete mechanism doesn't happen, but part of the mechanism happens.
Yeah. Part of it,
And so, in other words, if we made bigger shoes,
I don't know, and I would love to see a study.
The first digit, we'd get more. We'd sprint better.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's theoretically right. Why not? I don't know.
So just for anybody who's watching who wants to just unpack what Nuno was just saying, when he talks about the windlass mechanism is the mechanism of the foot through each gait cycle. So the gait cycle and human gait, clinically, human gait is described as a series of controlled falls, where we move our center of mass over our contact point in our foot, and we basically, the foot, first it collapses to the center line, or medial collapse, then we go up onto the toes, and then we supinate, we roll out to the outside, and then we come back from the heel, and we sort of go in this circle, or I guess it's technically triangular motion, because the foot is essentially a tripod of the heel, the fifth toe, and the first toe. But in cycling, because we never move our center of mass forward of our point of contact, the windlass mechanism doesn't have to operate. Is that a fair enough description, Nuno?
Yeah, and I don't even know how much you wind the plantar fascia, just because the hallux you cannot dorsiflex the hallux. So I don't know how much do you wind that fascia, or if you wind it, or if when you elevate your finger during the pedal cycle, is that enough to even stretch the fascia to the point that the navicular suffers a raise or not? So when I say I don't know if the windlass mechanism even happens in cycling, this is what I mean. I don't know, because you have to wind it. And
what Nuno's referring to there is the fascia, and he's referring to the plantar fascia, which is everybody, it's a common, I have plantar fasciitis, which that's not a diagnosis, that's a symptom. So that's the soft tissue which runs underneath the foot, which runs all through this part of the foot here. And when we're walking, it's constantly being stretched. And it kind of works a little bit like a leaf spring, where it stores some energy when we weight it and compress it, and then returns some of that energy. But in cycling, because we never compress the foot, or we shouldn't compress the foot in the same way as walking and running, the question is that does or does not, does not happen.
And there's several questions regarding the navicular height of an insole, because when you're running, the compressive forces are too much, and the navicular drop is X.
Yeah.
But in cycling, the navicular drop is X plus something, just because the compressive forces are not great enough to drop that navicular arch. So I would even argue that you have to have a higher navicular arch in the insole
in cycling
than in running.
For sure, I 100% agree with you.
Yeah.
You will sustain you will tolerate a higher navicular starting position or position in cycling way better than you just wouldn't tolerate that position in running.
Yeah.
In correction.
Do you guys do the navicular drop test at all?
No. Well, I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, and I measure that in every fit that I do with, yeah. It's worth measuring just to see, and that gives you an idea of it.
Yeah.
I just kind of look and I say, hey, look, this is what it looks like.
But you've got a device. You've got a device behind you which is better than theory, which is you can actually
I make insole. I do the custom
make insoles and sand them down. Yeah.
Greg does that too.
Yeah.
Oh,
really, also I'm the only one.
I think it's vital. And
no, we're going to get you those, Nuno. I'm going to get you set up.
Yeah. I think it's definitely one of those things from a cyclist standpoint, from a bike fit standpoint, just having, because no manufacturer even supplies a acceptable, in my opinion, footbed or support or medial arch support in their cycling shoe. I don't think there's a manufacturer out there. I mean, who am I missing, guys?
No, the foot's too variable. There's too much variability in the foot.
Exactly.
So maybe next episode we can talk about what Chris does with his insoles, because he mentioned something that was really clever. At the same time, I was reading something about plantar heel pain and fat pad atrophy and stuff like that. And the two of us just combined the knowledge, and he was like, "Oh, so that's why they prefer this thing that I do."
It's the heel cup. Like I size up the heel, make a heel cup that comes up around the heel, grind it down so it doesn't take much space, but it stimulates the area around the heel. And I'm like, well, why does that increase a rider's stability on the bike?
Up the chain, exactly, and that's the proprioception that we're talking about, and that's the feedback mechanism. And something happens. I mean, the feet is one of those things that you have to try it with the person in the lab. You can use all the theory you want, but then something happens. If you have a pronated foot, you think, I'm going to use a device, an orthotics to correct for that, and what happens is it's even more pronated due to something called the neuromuscular effect, which is a central mediated effect, whereby the body has detected that we're trying to correct for the pronation, therefore is going to activate the intrinsic muscles and all the other muscles to actually increase the pronation. So actually, when you're introducing that device that is supposed to correct for that, is exacerbating that. And this central mediated effect it's so variable, and it depends on how aware you are of your proprioception. And it goes back to lots of things like even trust in the bike fitting appointment. Even trust. Do you trust your bike fitter for him to manipulate you or not? Like when you said you slip on ice, you freeze, and then all of a sudden you relax. This is a trust mechanism. Because the body now understands, no, I'm safe, I can relax. And that happens in all sorts of levels. But this is a kind of worms,
Yeah, one of the things I'll do when I'm making custom footbeds for people is, part of the prescription is that you can't wear the device for more than 60 minutes each progressive day for the first week.
Okay.
Because your body doesn't adapt very well, because the moment, like, people will come in and we'll slide them in their shoes and I'll be like, how does that feel? And they're like, wow, I really feel that arch support. And it's pretty uncomfortable. And I'm like, cool. You'll accommodate to that position because you're moving your body out of its natural position. And so all of a sudden, as you were saying, you'll start to try and correct back to whatever your normal was. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to shift where your normal is to your normal also being your optimal.
Yep. And in the bike fitting, sometimes I find that what you were saying, Nuno, is true, is very true for me. And I tell clients right off the bat, I'm like, your body's either going to eat it up or it's going to reject it. This is what I see. This half of the time, or not half the time. I'm not going to give it a 50-50, but this is what I see. This is what I would typically do. You might like it, you might not. And then I do the exact opposite to see whether or not that sometimes the body reacts positively to the opposite adjustment. And then I have to make the decision whether or not I think that is consistent with biomechanics integrity or not. But it is very interesting to me that what I think is going to happen frequently does not. I see somebody on a bike, they look great, and all of a sudden I start stretching them out. They don't look any different, but I've added 4 centimeters to the reach, and they can breathe.
But that's the difference between and what we a lot of is the difference between having following a system or having a process, right? And so when you follow a system, it's like it's different. You can appreciate this here in the US, Chris. It's maybe different in the UK because you have a slightly more evolved system. Nuno, is that if you go into physical therapy with X injury, they have a system where you do 4 weeks of this and then 4 weeks of that and then 4 weeks of that, and then you're discharged and you're good to go. Whereas the processed approach is you look at something and you think you know how to fix it, then you try that, and it's like you have to reassess. And when you reassess, you find out what you actually didn't work. And I think that's where, certainly in bike fitting, that happens with a lot of the system-based bike fit, is they're like, oh, well, you fall within the numbers, so now you're good to go.
Everything's green.
Right? And it's just, the human body is just the most incredibly adaptive mechanism, but it doesn't always adapt the way we expect it to adapt.
No, yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the dangers, but also one of the things that I think is
that's why we're an apex predator. Right? We can adapt, dude. I can chop one of your arms and one of your legs off, and you can still ride a bike.
That's true. And that's why I think bike fitting is so challenging and so interesting, because you never know what comes through the door, how they will react, and you are constantly being challenged by the client at several levels. The interaction, the client fitter relationship has to change throughout the session, etc., etc., etc. Yeah.
Well, Matt, boys, I think we've chased the hands around the clock. We've just topped the hour mark, and as we said at the start, you the three of us could chat forever about these things. But I certainly think this has opened things up and left us certainly some runway to jump into certainly the foot things deeper. We're going to jump into saddles. We're going to jump into hand positions and handlebars. There's just going to be a ton of content, and I'm sort of looking forward to getting back together again in another episode to talk about more stuff. As we go out the door, Nuno, closing comments.
Thank you very much. No, I really appreciate it. I've been wanting to do this for quite some time. I think it's needed, and I think we need these sort of informal chats over a certain industry for the industry to evolve and to succeed. There needs to be the spread of knowledge, the share of knowledge, and people like us that are willing to just open our failures to the world and open our experiences. I think it's healthy, and it will benefit the industry and will benefit our colleagues. And I thank you, Greg, for the opportunity, and Chris as well.
Awesome, mate. And Chris?
I just think it's great that I got you guys together. I mean, I've been wanting this for a long time. I mean, you guys, I talk to a lot of people in the industry, and you guys are really smart people that think outside the box, but also use practical application as much as theory in what you do, and I really appreciate that. So thanks for having me on this.
Thank you, Chris, and I thank you both for coming on. And once again, we've finished an hour with more questions than answers, and that's the great way to be. We just keep searching because none of us have it figured out. It's why it's called a practice. But yeah, thanks again, guys, and we'll loop back again soon. Thanks everybody for watching.
Thanks, Greg.
Thanks so much.